Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Cecily. I'm the program coordinator for the bookstore at Busboys and Poets. We are joined tonight by award-winning author Robert H. Mayer. He's here to talk to us about a seminal work, In the Name of Emmett Till. It's a fantastic piece of work that looks at the young people who stood up at that time and made a big change in our country. Joining us as well is our very own Lori. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us on stage.
For those of you who don't know, I also work for Busboys. I'm the Director of Operations. And thank you all tonight for joining us. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Robert here. And is it Dr. Robert?
Generally Bob, but yeah.
Dr. Bob. So Dr. Bob has written extensively about the Civil Rights Act, children especially who worked in the movement, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I do want to say that we will do a short little trigger warning for, of course, violence against children, anti-blackness, racism, and overall just awful adulting. So I think that kind of sums that up, huh? Lovely. And so to kind of start us off, Robert didn't just I'm sorry y'all, Dr. Bob didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm gonna write about this. Like just random, I looked through this, I was there, I'll write about it. No, he did a lot of research, a lot of work, and a lot of that work culminates in this here book. I don't know if you can see this, but I highlighted the hell out of it. There's a lot of really awesome information. I don't know if y'all can tell, I'm 25 years old, and grew up here in the United States with a public school education, but didn't quite get the education that I got reading this book in the last few weeks. So, Robert, you spent time in the Mississippi Delta learning firsthand from the very folks who were on the ground as teenagers and young adults. You talk about this in the intro of your book. If you're on live stream, you can purchase it online in Eventbrite. And it seems like it really stuck with you. I mean, you wrote a whole book about it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience and what you meant to do with In the Name of Emmett Till overall?
Sure. That involved place, and so before I answer that, I just want to make a connection between Busboys and Poets and the book. I read the website and I saw that Busboys and Poets was a reference to Langston Hughes, which was exciting to me. And the last chapter in my book is about Freedom School, which took place in 1964 in Mississippi. And one of the things the young people studied in Freedom School was Black literature, something they had not studied in their schools. And one of the poets they studied was Langston Hughes. They didn't just study Langston Hughes. Many of the teachers reported that he was their favorite poet. They loved Langston Hughes. And I'm guessing all of you who know Langston Hughes will understand why. So I wanted to make that connection since we're in place.
A Raisin in the Sun, I will admit, is one of my favorite pieces. So shout out to Langston. Obviously we're big fans here at Busboys and Poets.
So can everybody hear me, first of all? Okay, good. If you can't, please let me know and we'll adjust somehow. So I spent 3 months in Mississippi at an NEH seminar. And at that seminar, we encountered the most important scholars related to the Mississippi movement. John Dittmer, who wrote Local People, and Charles Payne. But then we also encountered activists. Now, I'm going to confess that while I was down there, I did not quite understand how important these people were. I'll give you one quick example. I don't know if you are familiar with Dave Dennis. Dave Dennis, actually, my book allowed me to discover this. We heard Dave Dennis talk. He had some unfortunate connections with the people who, the three civil rights workers who were murdered in Mississippi. But that's really not the important thing about Dave Dennis. When I look back at my book, I kept seeing that I mentioned Dave Dennis over and over and over again. That's a slight exaggeration, maybe 3 times, 4 times. He was a member of CORE, and he continuously trained the young people in nonviolence. And that became an important aspect. So that's somebody we met who was really important. Another person we met was Dory Ladner, who I write about. Dory Ladner was a teenager at the time. Her and her sister were very active. And Joyce Ladner lived in D.C. Some people here might know her or be familiar with her. But they were teenagers when they got involved in the movement. So they kind of reflect a lot of the people that I wrote about. So that spending those 3 weeks in Mississippi, meeting those people, I had already been writing the book, but being in Mississippi gave it a lot of substance. Like one thing we did in Mississippi, we took a tour of the Delta. And one of the things we saw was Bryant's grocery store, where Emmett Till encountered Carolyn Bryant, which led to his lynching and murder. And it's like, it's all covered in ivy. They've done really not much to preserve the building. I don't think they know what to do with it. And the sign outside of the store keeps getting shot up. So we visited that place, and that gave much substance to the book.
I'm really glad that you brought up the namesake of the book, Emmett Till. I don't know who's watching it, but for those of you who don't know, Emmett Till was unfortunately a 14-year-old boy who was lynched while visiting his family in Mississippi. He was from Chicago. And you actually write about this, where his mother tried her hardest to warn him that the social structure was very different from Chicago down south. And he unfortunately was kidnapped in the middle of the night. Countless things were done to him, and his body was found a few days later with just weighed down in barbed wire. His mother was beside herself, of course, and he's most famous for the photo that was published in Jet magazine of him at his casket. His mother insisted it's an open casket. Let the people see what they've done to my boy. And in the book, it comes up again and again how many of these kids who later on became, the very freedom writers, fighters, everybody that was involved in their little rural towns, in their, in their counties, always brought him up. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I can just share, I mentioned Joyce Ladner, who was a Mississippi activist, and she said, ours was the Emmett Till generation. She says, no other single incident had a more profound effect on so many people who came into SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the main organizing group in Mississippi. And she goes on, we had seen the Jet magazine cover of Emmett Till's disfigured and bloated face with one eye missing. We were his age and could identify with him. I felt that if they had killed a 14-year-old, they could also kill me or my brothers. We knew that men were lynched, but we'd never known of a child being lynched before. On a profound personal level, this reality had a strong galvanizing effect on all of us. The image is with me still. It became etched in my generation's consciousness. And just about all of the young people, the interviews that I read, made some reference to Emmett Till as being an important influence on them. And that it's still with us. Just this week, I'm not sure you were aware of this, but Bobby Rush, Representative Bobby Rush, they just passed, the House just passed almost unanimously the Emmett Till anti-lynching law bill. And Bobby Rush, who grew up in Chicago, is the one who introduced the bill. And in talking about it, he said something very similar to what Joyce Ladner had said. He referred to the picture in Jet magazine as something that never left him and was an influence in the bill. And the other thing I'll say real quickly about this is, I think too, Alicia Garza's picture is in the other room, one of the three founders of Black Lives Matter. The three women who started Black Lives Matter were moved by the murder of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And it's a parallel to what the young people talked about in Mississippi, that they were undone by that murder, that lynching. And that started the Mississippi movement as the Black Lives Matter movement got started today.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. They kept saying, we're the Emmett Till generation, and I couldn't stop to think of Trayvon Martin. God, I don't remember how old I was. I was a teenager. I was in high school when Trayvon Martin was unfortunately shot and killed. And history repeats itself. We're constantly in this cycle of repetition. And I'm glad to say that just like today, we see young folks out on the front lines doing the work that needs to be done. And that was also what was being done in the 60s and 50s. You always hear about Rosa Parks, but you don't hear about Claudette Colvin, and you don't hear about Brenda Travis. Now, Brenda Travis, for lack of a better word, she was a baddie. She was the baddest, and so I don't butcher it or anything. Can you actually tell the audience a little bit about this young lady?
Sure. And by the way, there's a video interview with her, so you can, if I get you excited about Brenda Travis, you can go online and find her talking. The other thing, I should get into it quickly, but the other thing is she also has a memoir that was published by New South Books, so you can dive into it. But let me try to explain why. She is part of that Emmett Till generation. She was about 10 when Emmett Till was lynched, and at that time, she was undone. At 10 years old, she was undone by it, and swears, she says, one day. She says, one day. And so about 6 years later, she's 16 years old, and her one day comes. She gets actively involved in SNCC. The great, I don't know if you're familiar with Bob Moses. He's another one that we need to teach in schools. And sadly, Bob Moses just passed away a few months ago. Bob Moses was the main organizer in Mississippi, main SNCC organizer. And Brenda Travis gets involved when Bob Moses comes to Macomb, Mississippi, where she lives. She's going door to door, trying to get people to go down to register. People can't vote, they can't register. And so the plan is go down and flood the city hall register. And Brenda Travis is one of the people going door to door asking people.
And back then, just asking could get you in major trouble, couldn't it?
That's right. And just, it could, but also going down and registering can get you in trouble. In addition to failing at the task, people lose their jobs because they go down. So that happens. So people aren't always answering the door when Brenda Travis comes. And she's getting frustrated by that. She's a 16-year-old kid. And so she decides, I'm going to do direct action. I'm going to go down to the Greyhound bus station, and I'm going to sit in. So she and two other teenagers, two young men, go down to the Greyhound station in Macomb, Mississippi. And they walk in to the white section of the bus station, and immediately they're met with stares. People are staring at them. And then once it clicks in their heads, they start to yell things, the name call, the N-word. Brenda Travis calls it the no word. She says, I keep hearing the no word over and over again. Now picture, this is adults sitting in the bus station screaming at 16-year-old kids. And she feels fortunate the police come in and arrest her because she knows that if she sticks around much longer, she's going to get beat up. So she goes to jail. She's in jail for 29 days. She gets out. She goes back to school. And the principal tells her that the white superintendent has ordered him to expel her from school. So she's expelled from school, and
she's hilarious because she's like, "You want to let a white man tell you what to do with your black students?"
that's right.
Yeah, she was bold.
She was. And then her fellow students are equally bold. They are outraged that their friend, Brenda Travis, has been expelled for her civil rights activities. And 114 of her fellow students walk out with her, and they walk out of school. They end up going down to the city hall, and they all end up getting arrested as well. So there's more to that story and much more to Brenda Travis. So, but that's
That was a good, it was a good little intro to her.
Okay.
Please look her up. She is like, I feel like oftentimes you hear like, we're not our grandparents, but some of y'all grandparents were out there in them trenches as kids. Y'all were out there putting in that work, and she was truly one of them. Again, in reading the book, I personally, I'm Latina, my parents come from Central America, so much different trauma related to the US. Still trauma, but different. So I don't have any of those like personal family stories, so to like be reading this, I'm like, what adults are really just out here treating children like shit? And I'm sorry to the children who might be watching from home, but it was astounding, but also not, because we know it happened, but it's still just like, damn, I thought things are bad now. And there's always been a common misconception that young people aren't politically engaged or active, but the book definitely shows us otherwise. And not just any young people, like we're talking about Black kids in particular who are politically engaged, active, and ready for that change. And honestly, some who are more ready than the adults in their lives, because fear is a hell of a thing. Why did I never learn about them?
Oh, that is a huge question. I was going to say $64,000 question, but that would be generational here. Well, today, maybe I can start by saying today there is this movement to try to maybe stop having conversations, stop teaching Black history, and so when I went to school, we didn't study Black history. That was, but nobody thought much about that, and nobody saw it as an interpretation of history that was a really bad interpretation, excluding people. I guess I'm coming to the fact that there's something fundamentally racist in the school system, and it seems to be coming back again, something we have to fight. I don't know, I start there, I don't know, does that make sense to you?
As someone who went through PWI for undergrad, yes, it does. Very relatable. But there is something there, but there are a lot of adults who also influence these kids on the education side for them to do their best. So there was the Tulsa Nine and the college. There are so many historically black colleges that I had never heard of mentioned in this text, which is really unfortunate because that's part of the problem. A lot of historically black colleges aren't getting properly funded. They've had to close their doors in the last few decades, or unfortunately have been decertified due to that's a whole different story. But Howard Financial Department, we are looking at y'all. There's something afoot, and I always want to think educators of the future, the kids are the future, Not everyone's reading Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, unfortunately. So another great title you can get at your local Busboys and Poets.
Yes. When you say Paulo, I'm an former education professor, so Paulo Freire resonates.
Oh, yeah.
We talked a lot about critical pedagogy. And I guess the other thing about me is I was a social studies teacher. So
Gotta love them.
when we talk about teaching Black history and the new push to not teach divisive subjects, that completely contradicts my sense of education. When I taught social studies and what I encouraged my students to do was, we disagree. We disagree in a way where we're able to listen to each other, but we disagree. And that's somewhat divisive, but the goal is that we hear each other and come together.
Yeah.
So,
what are you thinking of, to bring it to contemporary terms very quick? We're seeing a huge push in, I don't want to say just southern states, but across the country with school boards and districts coming up with anti-critical race theory. I don't even want to call it that because I don't think they actually know what critical race theory means. They don't. But we're seeing a lot of pushback in an institutionalized formal front. Could you speak to us a little bit about that?
okay, well, I'll put it in the context. I think it's mainly a political thing. It would be wonderful to have a conversation with people who want to ban critical race theory, to have a conversation with them about critical race theory. It's also the way I think about my social studies teaching. A theory is an idea, and an idea is supported by evidence. So let's discuss it. Let's discuss critical race theory in the classroom. Ask the question, to what extent is systematic racism a part of the American system today? Let's talk about that. Let's discuss it. We're going to disagree, but let's talk about it. And
But we can't quite get the talking started when they're banning things like the 1619 Project, which shout out to Nicole Hannah-Jones, amazing piece of work.
right, and you say with the 1619 Project, that is an interpretation of history. It's arguing against the history that I experienced in school, that where there were very few Black people in the history I learned. That's an interpretation. And now Nicole Hannah-Jones invites us to think of history in terms of how slavery impacted the country. And that's a whole other interpretation. So let's talk about that and discuss it. And we may disagree, but let's talk about it. But as you say, people want to ban it. But I don't think, again, as with critical race theory, I'm not sure that people really have read the 1619 Project.
I just want you to sit down with some of these folks and just teach them a little bit, maybe not even about critical race theory, but just some facts. Because, it's crazy because we're learning about these youth activists and we're seeing, even here in DC, a large body of DC public school students came together and they said, COVID-19, this is still a thing. How are you protecting us in the schools? How are you protecting those of us who don't have the money to go to a private school, to be at a charter school, what have you? Because getting a little off topic here, but no one's looked at those HVAC systems in decades. These kids are this is anti-Black. This is racism at work in our education field. And it's crazy that we're still having that conversation. You know, Brown v. Board happened, and it took a decade for them to really like clamp down, start actually like making it so that, oh yeah, I guess we should be enforcing this thing that SCOTUS told us to do, huh? And it took a while, and it took the president a while to even say anything publicly, right?
Right. Well, I want to advocate, I think, teaching in the name of Emmett Till in the classroom. I would advocate for that, or at least teaching about the people that I write about. I think it would transform what happens in classrooms. I think about people like Sam Block, the 23-year-old, I call them the children, I'm 71, so I guess I can do that. He goes into Greenwood, Mississippi by himself. He's 23.
And tell us a little bit about Greenwood for those of us who haven't read yet.
Well, Greenwood is another Mississippi town where literally segregated, very few black voters. It was just in desperate need of activists. So Sam Block walks in by himself. He starts to head out to the laundromats, the pool rooms, and he just starts to canvass, talking to people about voter registration throughout the community. And that's where he gets this ball going. He's able to go into several, first the Elks Hall and then some churches, and he's able to talk to people. And slowly he gets people to go down to the LaFleur County Courthouse in Greenwood to register, which again is a desperate, dangerous thing. You can get beat up, you can lose your job, you're humiliated because you take this literacy test, which is set up to failure.
They were still asking questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap?
Right. That's right.
Yeah,
So,
in 1965.
So Sam Block is organizing this, and slowly this powerful movement develops in Greenwood. Dick Gregory comes down to Greenwood and supports the movement. It becomes a powerful movement. Smith moves in, lots of people, and eventually, and this is true of the work that people did in 1963, 64, we get legislation out of it. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 grows out of a movement like Greenwood, which again we don't talk about in the classroom. So we get the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and a lot of times it's thought of in terms of, well, Lyndon Johnson was kind and bequeathed this law to the black community. It was something that the black community of Mississippi fought for, people like Sam Block. So, yeah. So Greenwood is something that should be taught in classrooms, I think. There's other things in the book that I think resonate that aren't taught that much in classrooms.
It surprises me a lot that there is this period of, so one name we cannot miss out on tonight is Medgar Evers, and we'll get back to him in just a moment. But the tragedy of his death, he was assassinated. He was a large civil rights activist in Alabama and Mississippi. And upon his assassination, tensions got high. Like, it was very close to being a bloody massacre. So it's so funny because people are like, Lyndon B. Johnson was so nice. And it's like, it was getting to the point where something had to be done.
That's right.
Like, I think the first time Kennedy really spoke about it was because they're like one of the passages like, people are arming themselves. I don't know what to tell y'all. Black people are mad. And there's nothing scarier to a white person than a black person with a gun. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, that was happening as a result of the assassination. Medgar Evers was loved throughout Mississippi, and in particular the young people. He recruited the young people and set up youth councils with the young people. So when he was assassinated, there was just this tremendous anger. There were spontaneous demonstrations. The police saw that if they didn't do something, the town was going to explode, so they allowed a silent large funeral for Medgar Evers. But at the end of that silent march, people stopped being silent, started singing, and there was almost violence erupted. It didn't. It was stopped by movement people.
Yeah.
Stepped in to stop it. But yeah, Medgar Evers was beloved in Mississippi. And again, another person that we don't study in schools and ought to.
He actually investigated the circumstances around Emmett Till's death, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
In this lovely book, once more, just a plug, it actually talked about how he went out into the fields, because back then sharecropping was the child of slavery, and it was still very much in effect, you know. And so he would go out there and be in up shoes and coveralls and go and interview people, right?
That's right.
The answer's kind of obvious, but indulge me. Why the secrecy?
About Medgar Evers?
About the investigation that he was doing.
Oh, well, he was going into the fields to find witnesses to the murder of Emmett Till. And so, well, first of all, he's in the NAACP, which in Mississippi was, before Smith came in, the civil rights organization. So if anybody taught him, he would have been in trouble back then. But the other thing was he was going and trying to find witnesses, so those people were in danger as well. In fact, the people he finally found eventually had to leave
They moved away, yeah.
to be safe. So he had to disguise himself as a sharecropper to do that. And he did that frequently. He was investigating murders all the time.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about Medgar for those of us who haven't heard of him or lived under a rock for the last 60 years?
But he was the field secretary for the National Association for the NAACP. And that was the radical organization in Mississippi at the time. Because any civil rights activities in Mississippi at that time was radical. And he used the go door to door, talk to people on the streets method of organizing. And so he became known. People knew him. A friend of mine who grew up in Indianola talked about his memories. Barry Lee is about my age, and he remembers when Medgar Evers came to his house. And that's what he did. He would go and organize. And so he was absolutely beloved in Mississippi. And as I said before, one of the most important things was he created these, or he helped to organize these NAACP youth groups that formed the backbone of the movement. So very important. He's not one of those like loud, charismatic speakers you think of. Malcolm X is powerful. Dr. King's powerful. Medgar Evers did his work door to door, person to person. So we don't really know him, but we ought to. It's about American democracy.
It makes me think a lot about what Ella Baker said of how she would go about doing her activism, and that was talking to people. And I feel like a little bit of that has been lost, especially now, where it's a little scary to talk to somebody without a face mask on even. I don't know what I was going, but it's just a big part of that was just getting to know folks, and it's a little hard today now.
Yeah, that was the whole style of organization, and I'm not sure where it happens today, but this is another reason why we need to teach the Mississippi movement in schools. That idea of going door to door and working within the community is a fundamental democratic idea. It's something about our democracy. So we think our democracy was created in 1776, and then it was over. But we continue to create the democracy. It's a work in progress. And that's what people like Medgar Evers, Ella Baker, the young people in Mississippi do. they continued the work of the founders. So if we want to teach in our schools about American democracy, which is what social studies teachers do, then we need to be teaching this history. We need to be teaching Black history because it's fundamental to the American democratic story.
I almost feel like we're keeping this very history from kids, like it's their history, it's kids' history, and it's crazy. I don't know. All I can say is you should buy the young one in your life a copy of this book. And no lie, this is actually one of the most accessible books I've had the pleasure of reading. It reminds me a little bit of the accessibility of Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? I know, right? But it really like breaks things down for any audience. Like as an adult, I really enjoyed reading it. So if any of you out there are looking for a little book club action with you and your kids, highly recommend this one. But beyond that, are there other ways that educators can bring these stories home to their kids? Do you have any resources you'd like to recommend besides In the Name of Emmett Till?
Sure. Well, I mentioned the videos of the interviews of people. I mentioned Joyce and Dory Ladner. There's interviews that were done, several interviews that were done. So that would be a great thing for young people to spend some time with, is they can actually see the video interviews. There's also a lot of audio interviews. So just about everybody I write about has an interview. I have in my appendix, I have the...
Y'all, he wrote an appendix for the book. There's a whole glossary. There's a definitions guide.
And the appendix will point you to where the interviews can be found. But if you remember the names, like you remember Brenda Travis, you just Google Brenda Travis with the word interview and things will come up. So I think those are the most important resources. And that's something I tried to do in the book, is to let the people I write about speak through those interviews.
That was a really great part that I love seeing, that there were their own words. And you actually, like, you make a note of this in the beginning. You're like, anywhere you see the N-word, it's used in its original context to give you kind of the heebie-jeebies, the like feeling of just, oh, what is, such a nasty no word as
Brenda Travis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's one of the funny things. All these bills related to not making people feel uncomfortable. Well, a lot of the things I write about will make people feel uncomfortable. Hearing you seeing the N-word in the context of the language, the ugliness.
Because they used to throw the party R's around, y'all. They really did.
So but I think it's important to see that context and see the ugliness, and then return to the young people, because that we see what they're dealing with. Mm-hmm. And so
and that's the thing, they're not exempt from it either. They're getting the very same treatment and words and just cruelty that their families are, that their parents, their grandparents, and all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Racists don't save it for kids, apparently, y'all. They really don't. And so, it's funny. I really want to bring it back to just the young people. And one thing I remember was, I forget who it was, but it was a representative from New York City with the NAACP. He got arrested. He was like, I can't do this direct action shit no more. It's not for me. And he went back to New York. Could you talk a little bit about why direct actions were such, maybe not novel ideas, but they were new in the sense of being used in the civil rights movement? And these kids were doing it.
That's right. That's right. It's. I have to say, it's not new. My next book is about
his next book, y'all.
The 19th century, the Black abolition movement.
Yes.
And Black abolitionists were concerned about abolition, but they were also concerned about voting. They were concerned about being able to ride on streetcars. So a lot of the fighting they did before the Civil War was similar to the direct action of these young people. But yeah, the NAACP tended to be more, or at least the national office was more focused on passing laws and cases, all of which was incredibly important to do, but were less interested in direct action, which the young people of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were interested in. So people like Ella Baker, who was actually working in the NAACP, was waiting for these kids to come along. And when they came along, when the sit-ins happened in Greensboro and then throughout the South, she was so excited. So that was a shift, you're right, in the movement at that time. And it was the young people who put that forward, the college students at that time.
And I'm going to look over at our lovely, lovely assistant here. 10 minutes? Lovely. All right, so with the 10 minutes left, what do you want people to walk away after reading this book? Like, what is the one thing that you wish, even if they didn't read it, smack them over the head? What do you want them to walk away with?
Well, you mentioned something before that I should add. I want to write history that involves young people as much as I can. So that's going to appeal, I'm hoping, to all kids. But in particular, I hope that this is important for Black kids to read, that Black kids see themselves represented in history texts in a way that says, you've done something important, and you are, and you can be part of this. Which I think a lot of young kids, and particularly young Black kids, are. Back in May, my wife and I marched in a Black Lives Matter march, and we were two old people surrounded by all these young people, and that was liberating.
Now you mentioned this generational difference, and you mentioned it a little bit before we got on stage, but it's really important for you to really talk to, reach out to, and have some kind of influence on younger folks. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because obviously in the book, these adults came together and they mentored, they helped these kids out. I feel like we're missing a little bit of that sometimes. We're missing that like intergenerational coming together. And it's important, right?
It is. It is. I don't know exactly. I guess my role is partially through the book. I want to reach out to people from earlier, the current generation. I want to reach out through my book and tell them these things. One other thing I do is a tutor 8th graders. I haven't done it since the pandemic, but I'll do it again after things calm down. And I guess in terms of working with young people, what I want to do is get them thinking about things by introducing things that they may not be familiar with. So I guess that's how I see my role. When I go out to marches, I look for the young people to be the leaders of the march.
I love that, because that's really what it is. We are not lying when we say kids are the future, y'all. They literally become the very people who vote, who go out there, who do things. So shout out to the kids, honestly. And I mean, the kids of today are not disappointing us.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we talked about?
Oh, I think we talked about everything.
I think so, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Ooh, let's go ahead and transition over to the Q&A. And my lovely, lovely assistant's gonna walk around with the mic. Hello.
I am halfway through the book. I was really impressed by the young people's spirit back then. And I was also impressed by the infrastructures you mentioned NAACP back then, and plus many mentors to them. I was wondering, what do we have nowadays replaced like that.
That's, yeah. I hope you.
I'll let you think a little bit on that.
Good.
But, so I myself have some experience with youth activism here in the DC area. I don't know if you guys are aware of SMILE, but it was started as supporting and mentoring, it started as a sexual minority youth association league. So it was a place for LGBTQ teens to come together and seek resources during the 80s and 90s and just have a place to call home and find, their chosen families, kinship, etc. And it slowly morphed into an activist-focused group, and it now stands for supporting and mentoring youth activists and leaders. And I think it's those smaller organizations. I know we laugh a lot about sometimes the nonprofit industrial complex, but sometimes those are the spaces where these kids are coming together and having that opportunity to really do things. That's kind of what my own experience in that. So an outside organization similar to that. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess being my age, I look at people like Alicia Garza and Patrice Clon-Cullors who started the Black Lives Matter movement. I think of them as pretty young and exciting that they did that in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin. In my community, I think we have to look locally. In my community, there are people like construe as pretty young activists who are working and doing things. So, yeah, I would look locally. Yeah.
I feel like there's not that big overarching national organization like the NAACP or SNCC nowadays, but a lot of local grassroots-led efforts.
That's right. We just had this experience where we met some high school students who were very active in their high school, in their newspaper, trying to get the other students to be active and thinking, and going to school board meetings to advocate. So I think as I'm talking through this, I'm thinking that it comes through pretty much the local people, the local leaders. That's where I think it's very important to happen. So it would be nice if we had some national leaders too.
We got a question from our online viewers. Arkansas Congressman Tom Cotton said slavery was a necessary evil. What is your response to this barbaric and monstrous statement?
Who said that?
Arkansas Congressman Tom Cotton.
That's pretty ugly.
Yeah. I think a lot about how a lot of the white folks in those times were like, we let you live here, we let you work here, we let you get your little wages. Isn't that enough? And that's what my mind instantly went to with that. Is that a real representative today? That's wild.
Like recent, I think so.
You're right. Our lovely person here is in South Africa, so.
I think we need to hear those kinds of statements. They tend to get buried. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is to, as distasteful as it is, hear some of that voice of the people who want to perpetuate the Jim Crow system. And just to get it, how can you justify or explain this? So to some extent, hearing that's important, but then, we need to recognize it as something pretty ugly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Power is a hell of a drug. That's what it comes down to for me. Just, good God. No, kids, slavery was bad. It was not good. It was bad. Although you will hear, in some history books, people slave masters, owners used to say, they would have their Sunday service, and they'd say, God allowed y'all to be here on this field today. And that's crazy. we could get into a whole discussion about evangelicalism and racism in America, but that's for another book talk, I think.
The research I'm doing now for my book was about a Maryland, a man who was enslaved, who came to Pennsylvania to retrieve 4 men who had fled from his farm.
Mm-hmm.
And he thought if he just talked to them and explained to them why it was better to return, they would do it. And so
Racism is a hell of a drug, y'all. My gosh. And they just, we'll just, no, we're not coming back.
right, that was it.
We're on free land, get out of here.
They kept going.
Gosh. Do we have another question?
Other questions? It's good to have more of a conversation.
It's okay if not. Y'all can be shy.
Do you plan on writing another book? I'm sorry, do you plan on writing additional books about?
I do. The book I'm writing right now is about an incident that happened in Pennsylvania called the Christiana Resistance. Another thing that isn't well known, it's something that happened before the Civil War, and is where the enslaver came to retrieve the men who ran away, and he ends up getting killed. And it created all this tension between Maryland and Pennsylvania, and was another thing that pushed us towards the Civil War.
And Maryland's a weird case in the 13 colonies. We were court-martialed during the Civil War. Hey, that's our reunion, y'all. And there's a very deep history here, a legacy of lynchings and just plantations all over the place. Another great book, Silent Shore, is about the lynching of a young man in 1931 in Eastern Shore, Maryland. So, yeah, Maryland's weird. I don't know. It's weird. I live here, y'all. I can say it. Old Bay, we love that stuff. I guess how far was that? Like, have you been doing research? So, Dr. Bob here is from Pennsylvania, Bethlehem. Is that close to where you live? Have you been doing like site visits and stuff?
We did one. It's a couple of hours from us, not too far. It's in southern Lancaster County. So it's just over the border from Maryland.
Yeah. We're weird. The shape itself is just, it's all over the place.
Hello.
Hi.
So I didn't have a chance to look at your book yet, but I don't know, have you guys had a chance to look at, ABC has a short series that they did called One Woman of the Movement. And it's about the Emmett Till story. I mean, it goes into, it's really deep details about everything. That's excellent. Did you see that?
I did.
What did you think about that compared to what you wrote in your book?
I was really, I'm usually a pretty big critic of historical telling on TV, but they made a really important choice. They focused on Mrs. Mamie Till Mowbray. They made her the center of the story, and that won me over right away. Yeah, and so she's just a great woman, and that comes through very strongly in the telling. And from what I could see, it was fairly historically accurate. They include Medgar Evers, going, disguising himself as a sharecropper, going into the field, and that. So I was really impressed with it. I thought they did a good job.
I didn't realize that was him, Medgar Evers, that went out to that.
What's that thing called again? I'm gonna have to watch it.
Women of the Movement, and it's on ABC's, has a short series, I think it's like 6 episodes. Excellent story.
They keep changing series. I'm like, I would expect the season to be 20 episodes. Now they're 15, now they're 9. Now you're telling me 6, but I bet it's good. That sounds real good. Speaking of which, is there anything, like, since you're such a huge critic, is there anything we can watch otherwise that you would recommend?
Well, my favorite documentary about Mississippi is called Freedom on My Mind. And it is just, it's great. And that's a documentary that lets the people talk. One of the people in that documentary I wrote about, Desha Underman Holland, and she just jumps off the screen. She's such a powerful presence. So that Freedom on My Mind is really great. I mean, there's the things people probably know. I like 13. I teach a civil rights class, and we show them "I Am Not Your Negro," the James Baldwin, and that is great too.
Big fans of James Baldwin here at Busboys and Poets as well. If you haven't read him, you should. Do we have any?
Yes, I have more to comment also. I'm originally from Oklahoma, and I don't know as far as you may be familiar with the Tulsa riot.
Yes, sir.
And, or massacre, I'm gonna call it.
Yes, sir.
But what I was doing back then for a while, before the COVID-19, and I'm still kind of doing it now, was there's a resource online called newspaper.com. And so I'm from a small town. So I went back, I was researching my family, but I was amazed of how many stories it talks about lynchings and people being drugged of black people back then in the 1910s and 1915. And it just made me think that maybe Emmett Till story is not that unique. Maybe it's not that unique because it's, even farther back then, people weren't able to give their story or it wasn't available to be nationalized. So I think also, I think a good resource also is to go back and look at some of these small town newspapers, and they're actually giving real accounts of what's happening to black people.
Yeah, you're so right. There is now in Montgomery, Alabama, a memorial to the lynching. So, and it acknowledges what you just said, that it wasn't just Emmett Till, it was just going on all the time. In addition, the Tulsa massacres was not an isolated incident. In Philadelphia, there were massacres. In New York City, I just read about the draft, they call them the draft riots, but they went and they killed black people in the streets during the Civil War in 1863. So that's not isolated either. That's true.
I'm really glad you brought that up and you called it the massacre, because that is not what I was taught in school, but as an adult, that was a massacre. And one thing I really, really love about like this revitalization of history is, and this is a little childish, but anybody watch Watchmen? You watched that?
No, but I've heard that.
You got to, because it actually opens up with a depiction of the Tulsa massacre, and it set place in a fictional world where Tulsa actually has like done reparation efforts, and there's a community like center where people can go, and descendants can actually see family trees and histories and things. And it's something that kind of gives me a little bit of hope for the future. And I think a lot about, and I know that there are a lot more Tulsas out there.
If you're interested in a depiction of the Tulsa Massacre, it's also in Lovecraft Country, which is how I learned about it.
HBO's been on
I've never
it.
heard about it. So if anybody else is interested in watching it in that.
Everyone said, due to your age and research, you have a wealth of knowledge with regard to race relations. And so I'm a numbers guy, not really much of a history buff. And so If you think of race relations from a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10, 1 being the worst of times and 10 being the best of times, where would you say we are right now? And why would you give the answer that you?
Whoa. Things seem to go back and forth. It's like after the murder of George Floyd, it seemed like people are finally getting motivated and doing something and angry about things. And it seemed, for the moment, a permanent thing. So if you had asked me that question just after his murder, I would have said, okay, things are getting better. People are becoming aware. But now in this current climate where we're trying to stop the conversation about Black history and, it seems like we're taking a step back. So I'm hopeful that this moment will pass quickly. I'm hoping it's a reminder that there's a foundation of racism in the country that is really firm, but we can fight it. Where do you think we're at? Do you think we're okay?
You haven't answered that question yet. What's your number? I'll give you my number after.
Oh, a number. So,
1 being the worst of times, 10 being the best of times.
okay, right now I would say 6.
We waiting on that number.
Next to what?
What?
No, next to what?
I think I just said.
Yeah.
I think 6 is fair.
What did you say?
So I think 6 is fair. As a younger person,
I was gonna say 6, yeah. Knock on wood, let's just hope nothing happens tonight because people, you never know, but people will be mad, people will be angry. And I just wanted to shout out to everybody always talks about how the progressive North, which we obviously know isn't the case. But our Midwestern activists, they're holding it down out there. I went to school in Minnesota when George Floyd unfortunately was killed, and that was insane to watch in a place that you thought would just be all white people who are just, oh yeah, sure, you betcha, eh? Good but, people think about how the South is backwards, but people have always been down there doing the work. People are all around doing that work. And I just say that because folks in the North like to get a little bit on their high horse. And I'm like, nah, y'all, people still like to go to Canada in those times. Stop playing.
The North definitely, it's Malcolm X said that South is south of the Canadian border.
And he was right. Although at this point, I don't know, everything's kind of, they're having their own issues up there. Shout out to Missing Murdered Indigenous Women. That is a very, very awful movement. And Canada and the U.S. we got a lot to say for our sins to numerous groups.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any more questions? No? Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate our conversation, Lori. That was great. So thank you.
Yeah, me and Dr. Bob here didn't talk before last Thursday, so we got this in the bag, y'all. We did this. And yeah, so if you would like, we have books for sale on the side. You can purchase a copy, or if you have a copy, just come on up and Dr. Bob will sign it for you. Thank you all so much for coming out. If you're looking at us through the live stream, thank you all for coming out. You can still purchase a book online until 9 p.m. tonight, Eastern Time, with shipping anywhere in the United States, including the price of the ticket. Thank you all so much. A lovely, lovely goodbye from us here at Busboys and Poets. Stay safe, stay well, peace and love.
Thank you.